Imagine this moment. You walk into the room and immediately feel it. The air is heavy. Your child barely looks at you. Maybe they give short answers. Maybe they ignore you completely. Maybe they slam a door or scroll through their phone like you're not even there. You ask a simple question, "What's wrong?" And the response comes back cold. Nothing. But you know it isn't nothing. Something is wrong. And the harder you try to reach them, the more distant they seem to become. For many parents, moments like this feel confusing, frustrating, and sometimes even painful. It can feel like the child you once laughed with, played with, and comforted suddenly sees you as the enemy. But psychology tells us something very important. When children are angry at you, the anger is rarely the real story. Anger is usually just the surface. Underneath it, there are deeper emotions: hurt, fear, embarrassment, disappointment, or the feeling of not being understood. Children often don't have the emotional tools to explain those feelings directly. Instead, those emotions come out as anger. To understand the psychology of children who are angry at their parents, we need to look at how children experience emotions differently from adults. Children's brains are still developing. The part of the brain responsible for logical thinking and emotional regulation continues developing well into early adulthood. This means that when children feel strong emotions, those emotions can feel overwhelming and uncontrollable. Imagine feeling something intensely but not having the words to explain it. That is often what children experience. So when frustration, sadness, or insecurity grows too big to hold inside, anger becomes the easiest outlet. Psychologists sometimes describe anger as a secondary emotion. This means anger often appears after another emotion happens first. For example, a child might feel embarrassed if they get scolded in front of others. Instead of saying, "I feel embarrassed," they react with anger. Another child might feel hurt if they believe their parent doesn't trust them. Instead of expressing sadness, they argue and become defensive. Anger becomes the shield that protects the more vulnerable emotion underneath. And for children, vulnerability can feel dangerous. Admitting sadness, fear, or shame requires emotional maturity that many children are still developing. So anger becomes the language they know how to speak. Another powerful psychological reason children become angry at their parents is the feeling of losing control. Children spend most of their lives being directed. Adults tell them when to wake up, when to eat, when to study, when to sleep, what they can do, and what they cannot do. Structure is necessary for development. But at the same time, children naturally crave independence. They want to feel like they have a voice in their own lives. When children feel like their opinions don't matter, frustration slowly builds. At first, this frustration might appear as small complaints. Then it becomes arguments. Eventually, it can become anger. From the child's perspective, the anger is not always about the rule itself. Sometimes the anger is about feeling powerless. It's about wanting to be treated like a person whose thoughts matter. Another important psychological factor is emotional mirroring. Children learn how to express emotions by observing the adults around them. If they grow up in an environment where people handle conflict calmly, they are more likely to develop those same skills. But if they grow up seeing yelling, criticism, or silent treatment during conflicts, those behaviors can become part of their emotional toolkit, not because they are trying to copy those behaviors intentionally, but because those are the behaviors they learned. Children don't just listen to what adults say, they watch how adults react. They observe how problems are handled, and they absorb those patterns into their own behavior. Another reason children may become angry at their parents is the feeling of being misunderstood. Every child has a deep psychological need to feel seen, not just physically present, but emotionally understood. When children feel like their feelings are dismissed or minimized, they can begin to believe that their inner experiences don't matter. For example, a child might say, "School is really stressful." If the response they receive is, "You don't even know what real stress is," the child may feel invalidated. To the adult, the comment might feel harmless, but to the child, it feels like their emotional experience has been rejected. Over time, repeated moments like this can create emotional distance. And when emotional distance grows, anger often fills the space. Validation is one of the most powerful tools parents have in preventing this kind of anger. Validation does not mean agreeing with everything a child says. It means acknowledging that their feelings are real. For example, saying something like, "It sounds like you've been feeling really overwhelmed," communicates understanding. When children feel understood, their emotional defenses often lower. But when they feel dismissed, those defenses rise quickly. Another hidden cause of anger in children is the fear of disappointing their parents. Children deeply value the approval of the people they love. When they believe they have failed to meet expectations, they may feel ashamed or anxious. But instead of expressing those vulnerable emotions, they react defensively. Imagine a child who receives a low grade in school. If they expect anger or disappointment from their parent, they may react with hostility before the parent even says anything. This is a psychological defense mechanism. By becoming angry first, the child protects themselves from the fear of rejection. In their mind, pushing you away feels safer than waiting to be judged. This behavior is especially common during adolescence. Teenagers are going through one of the most complicated psychological transformations in life. Their brains are developing rapidly, their identities are forming, and they are trying to understand who they are as individuals separate from their parents. During this stage, conflict with parents becomes more common, not because teenagers suddenly hate their parents, but because they are experimenting with independence. They are learning how to make decisions, express opinions, and define their personal identity. Psychologists sometimes describe adolescence as a process of psychological separation. This means teenagers begin creating emotional space between themselves and their parents so they can develop their own sense of self. This process can sometimes look like rebellion, but in many cases, it is simply growth. However, there is an important difference between healthy independence and emotional disconnection. Healthy independence still includes communication and respect. Emotional disconnection involves hostility, silence, or avoidance. When children feel emotionally disconnected from their parents, anger can become their main way of expressing that distance. Another important psychological factor behind children's anger is boundaries. As children grow older, they begin to develop a stronger sense of personal identity. With that identity comes a desire for privacy and autonomy. When children feel like their boundaries are constantly crossed, such as reading private messages, entering their room without knocking, or constantly monitoring their activities, they may interpret it as a lack of trust. Trust is closely tied to self-worth. When children feel trusted, they feel capable. When they feel constantly suspected or controlled, they may feel like they are seen as a problem rather than a person. That perception can trigger anger. Another powerful but often overlooked reason children express anger toward their parents is emotional overload. Children face many pressures that adults sometimes underestimate. School expectations, friendship conflicts, social comparison, fear of failure, personal insecurities. All of these emotional stresses build up inside them. But many children don't have healthy outlets for releasing those emotions, so the pressure continues to build. Then one small moment, a disagreement about homework, chores, or curfew, becomes the spark that releases all the built-up frustration. To the parent, the reaction may seem exaggerated, but to the child, that moment was simply the final drop in an already full emotional cup. Parents often become the target of this anger simply because they are the safest place for the child to release it. This may sound surprising, but in psychology, people often express their strongest emotions around those they trust the most. The child may not feel safe expressing frustration at school or around friends. But at home, where they feel secure, those emotions finally come out. Understanding this doesn't make the anger easier to experience, but it can change how we interpret it. Instead of seeing anger as rejection, it can sometimes be understood as a complicated form of trust. Of course, understanding the psychology behind children's anger is only part of the story. The other part is knowing how to respond. Many parents respond to anger with more anger. They demand respect, raise their voice, or immediately enforce punishment. While discipline is important, responding emotionally to emotional behavior often escalates the conflict. When two people are both operating from anger, the conversation quickly turns into a power struggle. Psychologists often recommend something called emotional regulation before correction. This means calming the emotional situation before addressing the behavior. When a child is overwhelmed by anger, their brain enters a state similar to survival mode. The logical part of their brain becomes less active. In that moment, trying to teach a lesson or explain reasoning rarely works. Instead, the most effective response can sometimes be calm presence, a calm tone, a pause in the argument, giving the child space to regulate their emotions before continuing the conversation. Curiosity can also be a powerful tool. Instead of asking, "Why are you acting like this?" which can feel accusatory, asking, "Is something bothering you lately?" creates a different emotional atmosphere. One question feels like criticism, the other feels like concern. Children may not answer immediately, but the tone of the question matters. Another powerful psychological tool is repair. Many parents believe that admitting mistakes weakens authority, but in reality, repair strengthens relationships. When parents acknowledge moments where they may have reacted harshly or misunderstood their child, it teaches something important. It teaches that relationships can survive conflict. It shows children that making mistakes does not mean losing connection. This kind of emotional modeling is one of the most powerful lessons a parent can teach, because children learn not only how to handle anger, they learn how to repair relationships after anger, and that skill will influence every relationship they have in life. One of the most important things to remember is that anger from a child does not automatically mean failure in parenting. In fact, conflict between parents and children is a natural part of development. The real question is not whether conflict happens. The question is how the relationship grows after conflict happens. Do both people retreat further apart, or do they eventually move toward understanding? Strong parent-child relationships are not defined by the absence of disagreement. They are defined by the ability to reconnect after disagreement. Over time, those moments of reconnection build trust, and trust creates emotional safety. When children feel emotionally safe with their parents, something powerful happens. They begin to open up again. They begin to share more honestly. And the anger that once dominated the relationship begins to fade. In the end, the psychology of children who are angry at you often leads back to one simple truth. Anger is rarely the real message. Behind anger, there is often hurt. Behind hurt, there is often fear. And behind fear, there is usually a deep desire to feel understood. When parents learn to listen beyond the anger, something important changes. Arguments become conversations. Walls begin to lower. And slowly, the relationship heals. Because sometimes the most important thing a child needs is not a perfect parent. They simply need a parent who is willing to understand what their anger is really trying to say.